Iran's power grid is now sitting in the kill zone. In a blunt warning from the Pentagon, the United States made clear that if the next round of talks fails, it is prepared to go far beyond missile sites and military depots and hit the systems that keep Iran running. Its remaining power generation, its energy industry, its critical dual-use infrastructure. That is not routine escalation. That is the kind of threat that points toward blackout pressure, industrial paralysis, and a direct assault on the machinery of the Iranian state. And that is why this moment is bigger than the headline. What is unfolding is no longer just a standoff over strikes, shipping lanes, or diplomatic leverage. It is the visible emergence of a far more brutal option, one aimed not just at weakening Iran's military, no, but at squeezing the country where modern life is most exposed. If that line is crossed, the war will not simply intensify, it will change shape. At the surface level, the headline was straightforward. Senior U.S. officials said American forces are locked and loaded and ready to strike Iran's critical dual-use infrastructure, remaining power generation, and energy industry if ordered. But the deeper story was not the phrase, it was the target set. Power plants, energy facilities, the grid. That is not routine language, and it did not come in isolation. It came with a ceasefire clock ticking toward expiration next week. It came with negotiations hanging in the balance. It came after a live U.S. naval blockade had already gone into effect. And it came with one more message delivered just as clearly. American forces are prepared to resume major combat operations at a moment's notice. So suddenly this no longer looks like a pause. It looks like staging. In practical terms, here is what has changed. Since Monday, the United States has been enforcing a blockade around Iranian ports and coastal access points after talks broke down. More than 10,000 personnel, backed by warships and aircraft, have been positioned to enforce it. In the first phase, multiple merchant vessels were ordered to turn back. By Thursday, officials said that number had climbed further. The blockade has also widened beyond simple traffic control. Ships suspected of carrying prohibited cargo or materially supporting Iran have now been put under a far more aggressive warning structure: interception, search, seizure, and, if necessary, force. And this is where the picture started to widen, because the enforcement message was not confined to the Gulf alone. Military officials signaled that pursuit of Iranian-linked shipping or support networks could extend well beyond the immediate theater. In other words, this is no longer being framed as a narrow maritime operation near one choke point. It is being presented as an expandable pressure architecture. Then came the threat to the grid, and once that entered the frame, the whole story changed shape. Up to this point, much of the conflict had been understood through familiar categories: airstrikes, missile launches, proxy pressure, shipping threats, regional deterrence. Brutal, yes. Dangerous, absolutely, but still recognizable within the logic of military escalation. What is now being suggested is something broader, that if diplomacy fails, the next target may be the electrical backbone and energy machinery that keeps Iran running. That is a very different form of pressure, because electricity is not just another sector. It is a state's nervous system. It powers command centers, communications, pumps, refineries, industry, ports, refrigeration, transportation, hospitals, and water distribution. Energy infrastructure is where civilian life and strategic capability overlap. That is exactly why officials use the phrase dual use. It is the language of military justification. But everyone understands what it really means. These are not abstract nodes on a target map. These are the systems that decide whether cities function. And that is where the stakes rose. At sea, warships are already enforcing the pressure. In command rooms, targeting options appear to be ready. In diplomatic channels, the message is being sharpened. Open the Strait of Hormuz. Accept terms. Move toward a deal. Or the next layer of force may not be aimed only at launch sites and military depots. It may go straight at the infrastructure that keeps the country powered. That is an extraordinary threat, especially in this region. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway, it is one of the central valves of the global energy system. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil and gas exports ordinarily passes through it. Even limited disruption there sends shockwaves far beyond the Gulf. This war has already produced the biggest supply disruption in global oil and gas markets in years. Prices have surged. Shipping risk has jumped. The traders, insurers, and governments are all watching the same narrow strip of water and asking the same question. Is this pressure campaign about to become an infrastructure war? And Iran has already hinted at the answer it may choose. Earlier in the conflict, Tehran warned that if its power grid and energy facilities were hit, retaliation would not stay contained. Iranian messaging pointed directly at Gulf energy and water systems. Not just oil, not just gas. Water. Desalination. The basic infrastructure that keeps neighboring states alive in one of the hottest and driest regions on Earth. That matters because it reveals the logic on both sides. Washington appears to believe that pressure on energy can force a decision. Tehran appears to believe that if its own infrastructure is targeted, the response should be symmetrical, or at least recognizably so. If Iranian power plants go dark, the threat is that Gulf facilities, export hubs, desalination plants, and possibly shipping lanes become fair game. Not because that would win quickly, but because it would spread pain across the entire region and drive the economic cost outward. That is how localized war becomes systemic crisis. And the risks do not end with missiles or drones. The deeper concern is spillover into cyber operations. Energy systems are among the most attractive and vulnerable targets in modern conflict. They are large, interconnected, increasingly digitized, and in many cases old. That makes them exposed. And Iran has spent years investing in cyber capability and cultivating relationships with hacker networks and proxy actors. So even if physical retaliation against the US on homeland remains difficult, the broader energy ecosystem around the United States and its partners is not invulnerable. If this escalates, the next attacks may not always arrive as explosions on a runway. They may come as outages, disruptions, data destruction, or cascading failures inside critical systems. That possibility changes the tone of the current warning, because the visible story is a blockade and a threat. But the hidden story is that both sides may now be positioning around the same strategic center of gravity, energy itself. Look at the sequence. Talks break down. A blockade begins. Ships turn back. Military leaders say they can restart combat instantly. Then comes the open warning that Iran's remaining power generation and energy industry are already lined up as potential targets. That is not random escalation. That is layered coercion. And what makes this moment different is that the United States is no longer speaking only in terms of deterring Iran. It is speaking in terms of disabling the infrastructure that underpins Iran's endurance. Analysts believe Tehran can absorb a total halt in oil exports for a limited period before production itself starts to buckle. That suggests the pressure is calibrated, not necessarily for immediate collapse, but for maximum leverage during a narrow diplomatic window. The ceasefire still exists. Talks still appear possible. Some proposals suggest limited maritime passage could be arranged under the right conditions. But the military message is now unmistakable. The pause is not de-escalation. It is a deadline backed by force. And that is the payoff to the entire story. The real event here is not that Iran's grid has already been erased. It is that the war has now openly moved to the point where a country's electrical and energy backbone is being discussed as the next instrument of compellence. That is the line that just shifted, not hidden in satellite imagery, not buried in a classified leak, stated in public, in front of cameras, while a blockade is already underway. So when people ask what just happened, the answer is this. Iran's energy grid did not just become vulnerable, it became central. Central to the military threat, central to the diplomatic pressure, central to the next phase of the war if negotiations fail. And once that happens, the conflict stops being only about strikes and counterstrikes. It becomes about who can still function when the lights, fuel, ports, and pumps are put under direct pressure. That is why this moment feels so dangerous. Because the most brutal shift was not a blast on the skyline. It was the open redefinition of what counts as a target. Once power plants and energy networks move to the center of the war map, the next shock will not stay inside Iran. It will travel through shipping lanes, oil prices, regional infrastructure, cyber networks, and fragile political calculations across the Middle East. And if that next switch is flipped, what looked like a tense standoff may be remembered as the final quiet moment before the entire confrontation widened.